welcome to this week's Exploring John's Gospel. We're going to begin in chapter 18 now with the actual passion narrative, or the story of the suffering of Jesus. You'll notice that in the story that we have here in John's Gospel, it's different to it is in the Synoptics. In the Synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the beginning of this Passion Week really begins with a triumphal entry into Jerusalem. Sometimes we would celebrate that on Palm Sunday, and that begins kind of that week of the Passion narrative. But for John's Gospel, of course, we know that the clearing of the temple, for example, has happened already at the beginning of the Gospel rather than at the end. And so in John's Gospel, really the Passion narrative begins, or the real Passion begins now when Jesus finishes the prayer that he was praying for his disciples in the world, and actually now going to the place where he's going to be betrayed and handed over to the authorities. And so we're going to be looking at that a little closely. And so we're looking at John chapter 18 and in verses 1 through to 18. So let's listen to that together. When he had finished praying, Jesus left with his disciples and crossed the Kidron Valley. On the other side there was a garden, and he and his disciples went into it. Now Judas, who betrayed him, knew the place, because Jesus had often met there with his disciples. So Judas came to the garden, guiding a detachment of soldiers and some officials from the chief priests and the Pharisees. They were carrying torches, lanterns, and weapons. Jesus, knowing all that was going to happen to him, went out and asked them, "Who is it that you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. And Judas, the traitor, was standing there with them. When Jesus said, "I am he," they drew back and fell to the ground. Again he asked them, "Who is it you want?" "Jesus of Nazareth," they said. Jesus answered, "I told you that I am he. If you are looking for me, let these men go." This happened so that the words he had spoken would be fulfilled. "I have not lost one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter, who had a sword, drew it and struck the high priest's servant, cutting off his right ear. The servant's name was Malchus. Jesus commanded Peter, "Put your sword away. Shall I not drink the cup the Father has given me?" Then the detachment of soldiers with its commander and the Jewish officials arrested Jesus. They bound him and brought him first to Annas, who was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest that year. Caiaphas was the one who had advised the Jewish leaders that it would be good if one man died for the people. Simon Peter and another disciple were following Jesus. Because this disciple was known to the high priest, he went with Jesus into the high priest's courtyard. But Peter had to wait outside the door. The other disciple, who was known to the high priest, came back, spoke to the servant girl on duty there, and brought Peter in. "You aren't one of this man's disciples too, are you?" she asked Peter. He replied, "I'm not." It was cold, and the servants and officials stood round a fire they had made to keep warm. Peter was also standing with them, warming himself. This is the start of the Passion narrative. It's the start of Jesus being handed over to the authorities. And it's filled with pathos, with emotion. It's filled with that sense of betrayal. And we see in this passage a number of different forms in terms of that betrayal, and we'll talk about that later on in the session. But what I'd like you to do now is to spend just some time thinking about that passage. What does it evoke for you? What emotions does it stir up? How do you respond to the word that it's actually bringing to us? Welcome back. In this first session, what we wanting to look at is some of the context in which this Passion narrative is taking place, and at least this part of the Passion narrative. Because the first thing we see is that there's a movement, there's a journey that takes place. And it's interesting that it mentions exactly where that journey is going to go. Of course, it ends up in the garden, which of course we now believe would be the Garden of Gethsemane. It's interesting that John doesn't mention Gethsemane. What he mentions instead is the Kidron Valley. Now, for me, that's very important and very significant, because what it means then is that we realize that he's not focusing on the garden. The garden's a place he's been to many times, but he mentions that garden is on the other side of the valley, or the Kidron Valley. And so Kidron Valley is important in terms of the geography of the story, about what's happening with it. So what do we know about the Kidron Valley? For those of you who may have been to Jerusalem, you would see that the Kidron Valley today is covered in tombs. One of the reasons why it's covered in tombs is because of a belief about what's going to happen at the end of the world, at the end of time, when in fact Elijah and Jesus come back to earth, come back to consummate the end of time, is that in fact they're going to do that through the Kidron Valley. And the door on the other side of the Kidron Valley, which is the Golden Gate, in fact, if you go to Israel today, is of course blocked up. It's sealed. But they believe, or at least the belief is, that Christ will come through that gate into Jerusalem. So you can see that the Kidron Valley has got a lot of other connotations to it. It's got the connotations of the end of the world. It's got the connotations of, for example, it's where Jehoshaphat in the Tanakh, or the Old Testament, actually defeated the enemies of Israel. It's also where during the Reformation of Hezekiah, that's where the altars and the connections with the other gods, where all the altars and things were thrown into the Kidron Valley, kind of disposed of in that valley. And so, almost in a sense, that when Jesus crosses over the Kidron Valley into the garden, it's almost that the Kidron Valley becomes a symbol, becomes a location of the renewal that Christ is going to bring, that he's going to bring a renewal, a reconnection with the world. And I think that's something that we need to understand about John's version of the Passion, is that what did Jesus come to do? Jesus didn't just come to forgive our sins. Jesus didn't just come so that we could go to heaven. Jesus actually came so that he would renew the whole system, so that he would restart the process of the relationship between the people and God. And that moving across the Kidron Valley is almost, in a sense, symbolic then of that change that's come. That what Christ has come to do has been to change what was there before into something new. And we're going to see some elements of that in other parts of this study today. So I think the Kidron Valley is important. It's that he goes through that valley to the Mount of Olives, which of course the Garden of Gethsemane is on the slopes of the Mount of Olives. And it's not mentioned in John, because of course the garden isn't the focus, but rather the travel across the Kidron. The garden, the end point, the place of his betrayal isn't as important as the movement there about what is he actually doing. He's going to bring the Reformation, as Hezekiah wanted to. He's going to overcome the enemies of our lives, as we see with Jehoshaphat. And it's that concept as well, that he will come and restore and renew and transform that which has been there before. The other geographical context that we need to hold on to here is that it's interesting the way in which this delegation comes and speaks to Jesus. That when Jesus asks, "Who are you looking for?" they mention Jesus of Nazareth. Now that's interesting, because of course, I mean, his full name would have been Jesus bar Joseph, or even Yeshua ben Yosef. I mean, depending on how you, or bar Yosef, it would depend on how you look at it. But they mention him as Jesus of Nazareth. Now it's interesting, that particular title for Jesus is only used one other time, and of course it's used by Nathanael. That when Jesus was calling his disciples, he looks at they go and get him and say, "Come, we found the Messiah. He's from Nazareth." And of course, Nathanael responds by saying, "What good can come from Nazareth?" Now, that's an interesting experience. But of course, if we understand the geography of Israel, it gives us some insight into where Jesus of Nazareth. Remember that the people that are coming to get him, by and large, would have been coming from Judea. Nazareth, of course, wasn't in Judea. Nazareth is in Galilee. Now, the Galileans were seen to be not quite right Jews. We see that in the synoptics, for example, where of course Peter is pointed out as being a Galilean because of his accent and because of his dress. That in some ways the Galileans were too connected to the Gentile world. They were too kind of cosmopolitan, maybe you could call it that. Remember, it was the northern kingdom, that kingdom of Israel, that had been destroyed by the Assyrians, which is where Galilee is. So when these officials come and say, Jesus of Nazareth, they wanting to make a separation between themselves and who Jesus is, saying that he's not quite one of them, that he's not quite kosher, to put it in a Jewish term. That's the concept there, that somehow he doesn't quite fit. And yet for John, that's so important that Jesus comes from Galilee, because he comes from that linkage place, that world in between the two worlds, between the Jewish world and the Gentile world. That in fact, what he's going to be doing now in the next in the Passion itself is not only save the Jews, but he's also going to come to save the world. I think that that's an important concept to understand. I think that's an important understanding here of the Passion, is that the Passion is not just to redeem the Jews, but it's to redeem the whole world. And that's why he's not Jesus by Joseph. He's Jesus of Nazareth. He straddles the two worlds of Judaism and the Gentile world. Because by what he's going to do on the cross, he's going to bring those two worlds together and restore them and renew them in him. As we think about that, I'd like us to think about what it means for us that Jesus crossed the Kidron. That in what way is Christianity different to what has gone before? In what way did Christ transform and renew and restore? And maybe in what ways have we gone backwards, back to the old, instead of actually celebrating and acknowledging the new? In another area, if Jesus is the Jesus of Nazareth, where he stands between the two worlds of the Gentile world and the Jewish world, what does that mean for us in terms of the way in which we connect with him and with each other? Welcome back. We're going to go a little deeper now into some of these symbols and connections that we have within this passage. And the first one is the delegation that comes to Jesus. Now, you need to realize that historically, this delegation would never do anything together. Because on one hand, you've got the Roman soldiers, then you've got the officials from the temple, and you've got the Pharisees. Now, to get those three groups together, to actually work together with anything, would have been historically impossible. It would never have happened. And yet the interesting thing is that when you add Judas to that, and we'll talk about Judas just now, what you have is arrayed in front of Jesus all those who would be in opposition to him. And I think for me, that's such an important aspect to realize, is that the Passion comes with huge opposition. There's an opposition from every organization, every authority, every religious authority, in fact, even civil authority in the Roman soldiers that come to get him as well. And if we look at it from that perspective, we realize that this Passion isn't received with enthusiasm. It isn't received with anticipation. It's received with opposition. And if we're going to understand that for ourselves, we need to realize that, in fact, when we too seek to bring about transformation, that when we bring about or try and bring about renewal, that is not going to be accepted. It's not going to be lauded. In fact, so often when we try and bring a newness of life into, whether it be our local churches or even ourselves, it comes with opposition. And in fact, all the authorities array against Jesus to actually stop this from happening. I think we need to respond to that and think about how do we deal with the opposition that Christ actually engenders. The second issue that I want to bring out in this area are the three characters that we see within the process. Two traitors and then Jesus. Isn't it interesting that in fact you get these two traitors in both Peter and Judas? And notice that in fact both of them really are traitors in the end. They're both betrayers. You've got the betrayal of Judas himself, who stands with the opposition. And boy, don't we know that within the church? That in fact, even from those who are within the church, from within the discipleship, actually sometimes are our biggest opposition when we try and bring about change and renewal in the church. But then what about Peter? That when he's confronted by the servant girl saying, weren't you one of his disciples? And it's interesting that the way in which the Greek puts this is in exactly the same way that Jesus says, I am Jesus of Nazareth. So Peter says, I am not. It's so interesting how the way in which John writes this, that he juxtaposes those two sayings, I am and I am not. And so Peter really betrays Jesus there in that courtyard. And we're going to see, of course, he's going to do it 2 more times as we continue in this passion narrative. Isn't it interesting that so often the betrayal of the church and the betrayal of the things of God often happen not from outside, but from inside, from those who would actively stand against renewal and transformation. And then, of course, by those who in fact just cease to be part of it. There's that old saying which says, evil never proceeds quite as much as when good people do nothing. And, I think that when we look at this situation, isn't that so often the case? Is that in fact, when we do nothing, that's when evil prospers. When we say, I'm not a disciple, because to be a disciple now will mean that I have to put my life on the line. Let's think about this as we go forward. What does it mean for us that in fact when we try and bring about transformation and renewal, that we're going to bring opposition, that in fact it will create opposition? How do we deal with opposition? How do we deal with those who would be either the Judas or the Peter in our churches? How do we engage people in that? What can we do to help that process? Let's discuss that together. In this final session, we want to talk about an application, but how do we apply this passage to our lives and the connections with it? And the place of application I want to deal with is, of course, Peter and his sword. It's very hard for us to figure out exactly why was Peter carrying a sword in the first place. But again, if we look at the context of the time, then carrying a sword, whether it be a short sword or maybe a Roman gladius, is a way in which you can just, protect yourself against the wild animals, let alone anything else. And so it's possible that, in fact, people did carry swords. But I don't think we should go down that particular rabbit hole, because I think that in many ways, when we do go down that rabbit hole, there's no real answers to it. I don't think that, in fact, it was a natural part of the disciples to carry swords. But I think it works in John's narrative here that Peter uses his sword. And he uses it in such a wonderful way. It says that he pulls out his sword and cuts off the right ear of the servant. Now, I don't know about you, but for me, it's quite hard to imagine how he does that, at least by accident. Because if the servant is looking at him, is facing towards him, then of course his right ear, would be over here, and he would be on the other side, remembering that Peter would most probably have been right-handed, and certainly would have used his sword in his right hand. Now, you can imagine that if he's got a sword in his right hand, how does he cut off the right ear of the servant? Well, I've thought through this concept for a while, because remember that the swords of this period were not, kind of the Errol Flynn rapier, where you could, flash it about. the swords that we're talking about, and most probably the sword that Peter would have been a fairly rudimentary, in fact, just somewhere north of a club. And if that's the case, how do you cut off a right ear without actually killing the person? Because if you're going to cut the right ear, how do you stop it before it actually hits their shoulder? And that would be much more than just cutting off his ear. In fact, what I love about this passage is most probably that the sword would have been on the left-hand side, and as he drew it, it would have actually cut off the ear on the way up, which for me betrays more of a sense of a lack of skill than really a desire to actually cut off that ear. And I think that's where Jesus is going here. Because Jesus tells him, put away your sword. Put away your sword. Aren't I ready to face then what in fact the Father has given me? I think that in many ways the put away your sword here is the key takeaway message. The application for me in this passage is about the fact that our response to opposition is violence. That's our go-to. That when somebody opposes us, our first reaction is to oppose them back, is to argue with them, is to fight with them, is to seek to win the argument. Notice what Jesus says. Jesus says, put away the sword. Am I not to drink the cup that the Father has given me? Now I know that for most of us, this is such a hard thing to see. But isn't it sometimes better to not fight? You know, when we look at the Christian history, the times when we have fought on the side of God, we certainly have brought very little honor to God. I think that we need to be careful about using violence as the means by which we seek to bring about change. And that means not just violence of a sword, but whether it means the sword of our tongues, that maybe we need to watch out the ways in which we share the concepts, the way in which we argue the point, the way in which we have to win every argument. And for those of us like me who love winning arguments, it's something I really need to work on. As we close this session, I want us to think about the response that we need to make to the opposition. How can we respond to those who would come against us without resorting to violence? Where in our churches can we still see the violence in action? And as we see those things, how can we transform them? How can we renew them? So that in fact, instead of responding with violence, we may respond in love and forgiveness. Let's talk about that.